The sky was a deep, endless shade of twilight, painted with streaks of violet and indigo. Lieutenant Kel Voss trudged through the alien terrain, his boots crunching softly on ground that felt like fine glass beneath his feet. The air carried an odd shimmer, almost as if the very atmosphere pulsed with life. He glanced up at the strange forest around him. Towering crystalline trees stretched high into the heavens, their translucent surfaces glowing faintly with hues of green and blue. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but equally unsettling. Cale adjusted the strap of his survival pack over his shoulder, wincing slightly as it dug into his skin. His mind raced with thoughts of how he had ended up here, alone on this uncharted planet. Just 2 days ago, he had been piloting his scout ship, EOS, on what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission for Earth's Interstellar Exploration Corps. But then came the malfunction. A sudden power surge in the engine core followed by catastrophic failure. Before he could send out a distress signal, the ship spiraled out of control and crash-landed on this mysterious world. Now, stranded miles away from the wreckage, Cale struggled to repair his damaged communication device. He knelt beside a makeshift workbench he'd fashioned from flat stones and debris scavenged from the crash site. The small handheld communicator lay disassembled before him, its circuits sparking weakly whenever he tried to reconnect them. Frustration bubbled inside him, but he pushed it down. Panicking wouldn't get him off this planet. As he worked, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement among the glowing trees. At first, he thought it might be his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, fatigue and hunger were starting to take their toll. But when he looked again, there it was, a shadow darting between the crystalline trunks. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they were watching him. Cale stood slowly, brushing dirt off his hands. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness of the forest. There was no response, only the faint hum of energy emanating from the trees. He took a cautious step forward, squinting into the dim light. "I'm not armed," he added, raising his empty palms to show he meant no harm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he began to think he'd imagined the whole thing, a figure emerged cautiously from behind one of the glowing trees. It was humanoid but clearly not human. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver, reflecting the soft luminescence of the forest. Large, almond-shaped eyes dominated her delicate face, their irises swirling with colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle. She wore tattered garments made of some kind of metallic fabric, torn and frayed as though she'd endured a long journey. But what struck Cale most was the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and defiance. She clutched her side, where dark stains marred the silvery sheen of her skin. Blood, or perhaps some other fluid unique to her species. Whatever it was, it didn't appear natural. "Are you hurt?" Cale asked gently, taking another small step toward her. He kept his tone calm, trying to convey trustworthiness despite the language barrier. The girl flinched at his approach, retreating further into the shadows. Her movements were graceful yet wary, like a cornered animal unsure whether to flee or fight. Cale stopped moving, realizing he needed to give her space. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small ration bar wrapped in foil. Holding it out in front of him, he placed it carefully on the ground before stepping back. "I mean no harm," he said again, though he doubted she understood him. Still, he hoped his actions would speak louder than words. After several tense moments, the girl hesitated, glancing between Cale and the offering on the ground. Finally, she crept forward, her every step deliberate. When she reached the ration bar, she snatched it quickly and retreated once more, clutching it tightly to her chest. Her eyes never left Cale's face, studying him intently as though trying to decipher his intentions. Cale stayed where he was, giving her time to examine the food. He noticed now that her injuries were worse than he'd initially thought. Dark bruises covered parts of her arms, and dried streaks of crimson ran down her legs. Whoever, or whatever, had done this to her was likely still nearby. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant chirping of unseen creatures. Slowly, the girl unwrapped the ration bar and took a tentative bite. Relief washed over her features as she chewed, savoring the taste. For the first time since appearing, she relaxed slightly, lowering her guard just enough to sit cross-legged on the ground. Encouraged by this small victory, Cale crouched down, keeping his distance, but making himself appear non-threatening. "You're safe here," he murmured, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. "I won't hurt you." She tilted her head, observing him curiously. Though she didn't respond verbally, her body language suggested she was beginning to trust him, at least enough to stay put for now. Cale smiled faintly, feeling a spark of hope ignite within him. Perhaps this encounter wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was an opportunity to learn more about this strange new world and the beings who called it home. As night fell and the forest grew darker, the glow of the trees casting eerie patterns across the landscape, Cale settled down near the edge of the clearing. The girl remained seated under the cover of the foliage, her luminous eyes watching him warily. Neither spoke, but the silence between them felt less hostile than before. For the first time since crashing on this alien planet, Cale felt a sense of purpose. This girl, whoever she was, held secrets that might help him find a way back to his people. And perhaps in helping her, he could forge a connection that transcended the boundaries of species and worlds. The next morning, the forest awoke with a soft glow as sunlight filtered through the crystalline canopy above. Cale stirred from his makeshift bed of leaves and moss, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. He glanced toward the spot where the alien girl had been sitting the night before, half expecting her to have disappeared during the night. To his relief, she was still there, though now she sat closer to the edge of the clearing, her shimmering form blending almost seamlessly with the bioluminescent surroundings. She looked up at him as he approached, her large eyes unreadable but no longer filled with the same hostility as before. Instead, they seemed to carry a quiet curiosity, as if she were trying to understand who, or what, he was. Cale smiled faintly, hoping it would reassure her. "Good morning," he said softly, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. His voice carried a warmth that transcended language, and she tilted her head slightly in response. Cale opened his survival pack and pulled out another ration bar, unwrapping it carefully. He held it out toward her, mimicking the gesture from the previous day. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for it, her movements slower this time, but less guarded. She took the food without snatching it away like before, and Cale felt a small sense of progress. Trust wasn't built overnight, especially not with someone so clearly traumatized. As she ate, Cale noticed her injuries again, the dark bruises, the dried streaks of crimson, and something new, a faint, pulsating glow emanating from beneath the torn fabric near her chest. It was subtle, almost imperceptible unless you were looking closely, but it caught his attention immediately. What could it be? Some kind of implant? A wound? Or something else entirely? Curiosity got the better of him, and he pointed cautiously toward her chest, making a questioning sound. The girl froze, her expression shifting from calm to tense in an instant. She clutched the area protectively, her body language screaming discomfort. For a moment, Cale thought she might bolt into the forest again, but instead, she shook her head firmly, her swirling eyes locking onto his with a warning. Okay, Cale said quickly, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you." He backed off, giving her space once more. Whatever that glowing object was, it was clearly sensitive and important. Over the next few hours, Cale focused on repairing his damaged communicator. He worked methodically, using tools salvaged from the wreckage of his ship. Occasionally, he glanced over at the girl, who remained seated nearby, watching him intently. There was an unspoken understanding forming between them, a fragile bond born out of mutual need and cautious trust. By midday, hunger drove Cale to prepare a simple meal using some edible plants he'd identified earlier. as he cooked over a small fire. The smell of roasted vegetation wafted through the air, drawing the girl closer. She hesitated at first, then sat down a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the flames. Fire seemed unfamiliar to her. She leaned forward slightly, mesmerized by the flickering light. "You've never seen fire before?" Cale asked, chuckling lightly. He waved a hand over the flames to demonstrate that they weren't dangerous, at least, not if handled properly. The girl blinked slowly, her expression one of wonder mixed with caution. She reached out a tentative finger, stopping just short of touching the heat. When she pulled back, her lips curved upward ever so slightly, the first hint of a smile Cale had seen from her. Encouraged by her reaction, Cale decided to try communicating again. Using gestures and exaggerated expressions, he pointed to himself and said, "Cale." Then he pointed to her, waiting patiently. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her swirling eyes narrowing slightly. Finally, she touched her chest and whispered, "Niera." Cale repeated the name, nodding enthusiastically. "Niera," he said again, pointing to her. Her shoulders relaxed, and she gave the faintest nod in return. Progress. With names exchanged, Cale felt emboldened to ask more questions. He gestured around them, mimicking walking and pointing to the horizon. "Where are you from?" he asked, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping the meaning came across. To his surprise, Niera responded, not verbally, but through actions. She stood abruptly and began drawing shapes in the dirt with her finger. At first, they looked like random lines, but as she continued, Cale realized she was sketching a map. There were jagged peaks representing mountains, winding rivers, and a cluster of symbols that might have indicated settlements. One symbol stood out, a circle surrounded by sharp angles, marked with what appeared to be claw-like designs. Niera tapped it forcefully, her expression darkening. She made a slashing motion across her throat and growled softly, mimicking anger or hostility. "They did this to you," Cale guessed aloud, pointing to her injuries. Niera nodded sharply, her shimmering skin rippling as though agitated. Whatever those symbols represented, they weren't friendly. Cale studied the crude map, committing it to memory. If these markings led to answers about Niera's past, and possibly a way off this planet, it was worth investigating further. But for now, he needed to focus on earning her trust completely. That evening, as twilight settled over the forest once more, Cale shared another meal with Niera. This time, she joined him willingly, sitting close enough that their knees nearly touched. They communicated through gestures and facial expressions, piecing together fragments of each other's stories. Cale learned that Niera had been traveling alone for days, fleeing something, or someone, that terrified her. In turn, he showed her images on his communicator screen, depicting Earth's blue skies, bustling cities, and vast oceans. Though she couldn't comprehend the details, her fascination was evident. But when Cale accidentally brushed against the glowing object embedded in her chest while handing her a drink, Niera recoiled violently. She scrambled backward, clutching the area tightly, her earlier calm replaced by panic. For several seconds, she stared at him with wide, fearful eyes, as if expecting betrayal. "I'm sorry," Cale said quickly, holding his hands up again. "I didn't mean to." Niera cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. Slowly, she calmed herself, taking deep breaths until her shimmering skin returned to its usual glow. Then, with great reluctance, she lifted the edge of her tattered garment, revealing the source of the pulsating light. What Cale saw left him speechless. Embedded in her chest was a small, intricate device shaped like a starburst. Its surface was etched with glowing runes that shifted and changed colors rhythmically, as if alive. Tiny tendrils of energy radiated outward, connecting the device to her body in ways that defied explanation. It wasn't just an injury. It was part of her, integrated deeply into her being. Niera covered it again, her expression grim. She pointed to the device, then made a sweeping motion with her hand, indicating destruction or removal. When Kel shook his head, unsure how to respond, she sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Though she didn't explain further, Kel could sense the weight of her burden. Whatever that device was, it was both a curse and a lifeline, and it tied her to forces far beyond anything he'd encountered before. As the night deepened and the forest hummed with unseen life, Kel lay awake, staring at the stars through gaps in the crystalline trees. Beside him, Nyera slept fitfully, her breathing uneven. He wondered about her story, about the world she came from, and the danger that pursued her. And he wondered whether helping her would lead him closer to salvation or deeper into peril. The days that followed were a blur of cautious movement and uneasy alliances. Kel and Nyera had established a fragile rhythm, traveling through the crystalline forest in search of shelter and answers. Though their communication remained limited to gestures and expressions, their bond deepened with each passing hour. Kel found himself constantly watching over Nyera, his instincts telling him she was more than just a companion. She was key to understanding this strange planet. But danger wasn't far behind. It came on the third morning after their encounter. The forest, usually alive with the soft hum of energy and the distant chirping of alien creatures, fell eerily silent. Kel noticed it first as he packed up their campsite. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unnatural tension. Even the glowing trees dimmed slightly, their light flickering like dying embers. Nyera stiffened beside him, her shimmering skin rippling with agitation. She scanned the horizon, her swirling eyes darting between the trees. When she caught Kel's gaze, there was no need for words. Her expression said it all. Something, or someone, was coming. "Let's move," Kel whispered, slinging his survival pack over his shoulder. He motioned for Nyera to follow, and together they slipped into the deeper shadows of the forest, moving as quietly as possible. They hadn't gone far when the first sign of pursuit appeared. A faint whirring sound echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. Kel froze, pulling Nyera behind a thick crystalline trunk. Peering around its edge, he saw them, 3 sleek, metallic drones hovering above the forest floor. Their surfaces gleamed ominously, reflecting the dim light of the glowing trees. Each drone was equipped with sharp appendages and glowing red sensors that scanned the area methodically. Nyera's breath hitched audibly, and Kel pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Her hands trembled as she clutched at the glowing artifact embedded in her chest, her fear palpable. Whatever these machines were, they clearly meant harm, and they were looking for her. Kel's mind raced. They couldn't outrun the drones indefinitely. The forest terrain was treacherous, filled with jagged crystal formations and unstable ground. But neither could they fight back, not without weapons or a plan. For now, stealth was their only option. Motioning for Nyera to stay close, Kel led her deeper into the forest, weaving between the towering trees. The drone's whirring grew louder, their sensors sweeping the area with increasing intensity. Every step felt like walking on eggshells, the slightest misstep likely to give away their position. As they moved, Kel spotted something ahead, a narrow ravine cutting through the forest floor. Its edges were lined with jagged crystals, making it nearly invisible from above. It wasn't much, but it might provide temporary cover. He gestured for Nyera to follow, and they crouched low, slipping into the ravine just as one of the drones passed overhead. For several tense minutes, they held their breath, listening as the machines hovered nearby. The drones paused, their sensors scanning the area repeatedly. Then, with a final sweep, they moved on, disappearing into the distance. Kel let out a shaky sigh of relief, though he knew better than to celebrate prematurely. "We can't keep running," he muttered under his breath, turning to Nyera. "Who are they? Why are they after you?" Nyera hesitated, her glowing eyes clouded with emotion. Finally, she pointed to the map she'd drawn earlier, the circle surrounded by claw-like designs. "Lumen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first word she'd spoken since revealing her name, and it sent a chill down Cal's spine. The Lumen, Cal repeated, piecing together what little he understood. Your people? Niera nodded, her expression grim. She made another slashing motion across her throat, mimicking hostility. Then she tapped the glowing artifact on her chest, her meaning clear. The Lumen wanted it back, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. Cal's stomach tightened. If the Lumen were as advanced as their technology suggested, they weren't dealing with ordinary pursuers. These were hunters, relentless and efficient, and if they caught up to Niara, there was no telling what they would do. We need to slow them down, Cal said firmly. He glanced around, taking stock of their surroundings. The forest was dangerous, yes, but it also offered opportunities. With some ingenuity, they could turn its hazards into traps. Over the next few hours, Cal put his knowledge of Earth's guerrilla tactics to use. Using vines and fallen branches, he fashioned tripwires designed to entangle the drone's appendages. He rigged explosive crystal formations with makeshift detonators, creating booby traps that would collapse sections of the forest floor. Niara watched him work, her curiosity evident despite her fear. Occasionally, she offered suggestions, pointing out weak points in the terrain or areas where the drones might pass. When the traps were set, they retreated to a safe distance, waiting silently for their pursuers to arrive. It didn't take long. The whirring sound returned, louder this time, accompanied by flashes of metallic glint among the trees. The drones moved in formation, their sensors sweeping the area systematically. Cal held his breath as the lead drone triggered the first trap, a Cascado, yearning for her to continue. They traveled for hours, navigating treacherous terrain until they reached the base of the cliffs. Here, the forest gave way to rocky outcrops and winding caves carved into the mountainside by ancient rivers. Niara led Cal into one of these caves, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of cascading bioluminescent vines. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the walls glittered faintly with embedded crystals. This will do, Cal muttered, setting down his survival pack. He pulled out a small lantern, illuminating the space with a warm, steady glow. Turning back to Niara, he gestured toward the artifact. Now, he said gently but firmly, tell me everything. Niara hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them over the glowing object. For several moments, she simply stared at it, her expression conflicted. Finally, she began speaking, not in words, but through gestures and fragmented sentences, piecing together a story that left Cal stunned. She explained that the artifact was not just a device, it was a key to something called the Gyrith Vault, an ancient structure buried deep beneath the planet's surface. According to legend, the vault contained technology so advanced that it could reshape entire star systems. The Lumen had discovered its existence centuries ago and sought to harness its power to maintain dominance over neighboring civilizations. But accessing the vault required the artifact, which acted as both a map and a failsafe. Niara's role in all this became clearer as she continued. As a member of the Lumen elite, she had been groomed from birth to serve her people. However, when she learned of their plans to weaponize the vault's technology, she rebelled. Believing that such power would inevitably lead to corruption and destruction, she stole the artifact and fled, knowing full well the consequences of her actions. But why you? Cal asked, his brow furrowed. Why did they put it inside you? Niara touched the glowing runes on the artifact, her fingers tracing their intricate patterns. Part of me, she whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. Bound forever. She explained that the artifact wasn't merely attached to her. It had been integrated into her biology, fusing with her nervous system and life force. Removing it would kill her instantly. The Lumen had done this deliberately, ensuring that the artifact couldn't be taken without destroying its bearer. Cal absorbed this information, his mind racing. The implications were staggering. If the Lumen managed to retrieve the artifact, or worse, captured Niara, They would gain access to unimaginable power. And judging by their relentless pursuit, they weren't going to stop until they succeeded. As Neaera finished her explanation, she pulled something from her tattered garments, a small palm-sized crystal shard. Its surface was etched with the same glowing runes as the artifact, and it pulsed faintly with energy. Handing it to Kale, she said, "Map." Kale examined the shard closely, turning it over in his hands. When he activated it using a button on its side, a holographic projection sprang to life, casting ghostly blue light across the cave walls. The image depicted a vast underground network of tunnels and chambers, culminating in a massive circular structure marked with the same claw-like designs Neaera had drawn earlier. This was the Gyrith Vault. "Where is it?" Kale asked, pointing to the map. Neaera traced a line along the projection, indicating their current location and the path they would need to take to reach the vault. "Far," she said simply. "Dangerous." Kale nodded grimly. Reaching the vault wouldn't be easy, not with the Lumen hunting them, and the planet's hostile environment working against them. But they had no choice. If the Lumen retrieved the artifact, the consequences would be catastrophic. Before they could plan further, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Pebbles and dust rained down from the ceiling as a deep rumble echoed through the cave. Kale grabbed Neaera's arm, pulling her closer to the wall for safety. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice rising over the noise. Neaera's eyes widened in alarm. "They're here," she breathed. Sure enough, the sound of metallic whirring grew louder outside the cave, accompanied by flashes of red light. The Lumen had found them. "Stay close," Kale ordered, grabbing his survival pack and lantern. He extinguished the light, plunging the cave into darkness except for the faint glow of the crystals embedded in the walls. Together, they crept deeper into the cavern, following the twisting tunnels as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The Lumen weren't relying solely on drones this time. As they rounded a corner, Kale caught sight of humanoid figures clad in sleek, armored suits. Their movements were precise and mechanical. Our weapons glowing ominously in the dim light. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were elite enforcers, sent to ensure success. Kale and Neaera pressed onward, their hearts pounding as they navigated the labyrinthine tunnels. At one point, Neaera spotted a narrow fissure in the rock wall, a potential escape route. Without hesitation, she squeezed through, motioning for Kale to follow. It was a tight fit, and the jagged edges scraped painfully against his skin, but he managed to make it through. On the other side, they emerged into a larger chamber filled with towering stalagmites and pools of glowing water. The Lumen enforcers paused at the fissure, unable to follow due to their bulky armor. For now, they were safe, but only temporarily. "We need to move faster," Kale said, glancing at the map shard still clutched in his hand. They were running out of time. Neaera nodded, determination replacing fear in her swirling eyes. She pointed to the map, indicating a series of underground rivers that could lead them closer to the vault. "Water hides," she said cryptically. Understanding dawned on Kale. The rivers were subterranean, flowing through tunnels too narrow for the Lumen to navigate. If they could reach them, they might stand a chance of losing their pursuers. With renewed purpose, they set off once more, their steps quickening as the sound of pursuit faded behind them. The journey ahead would be perilous, fraught with challenges neither of them could fully anticipate. But as long as they stayed together, they had hope. The underground river stretched endlessly before them, its waters shimmering faintly with bioluminescent algae. Kale and Neaera moved carefully along the narrow ledge that bordered it, their footsteps echoing softly against the damp stone walls. The air was cool and humid, carrying the faint scent of minerals and something unidentifiable, something alive. Every so often, the sound of rushing water drowned out all other noise, reminding them of the raw power coursing beneath the planet's surface. Kale glanced at Neaera frequently, noting how she navigated the treacherous path with surprising ease. Her movements were fluid, almost instinctual, as if she had spent her entire life traversing such environments. He admired her resilience. Despite the weight of her burden, the artifact embedded in her chest, she pressed on without complaint. Yet he could see the toll it was taking on her. Her shimmering skin had dulled slightly, and her usually bright eyes now carried a flicker of exhaustion. "Are you okay?" Cale asked softly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the river. Niara nodded but didn't speak. Instead, she pointed ahead, where the tunnel opened into a larger cavern bathed in soft blue light. As they stepped inside, Cale felt his breath catch. The cavern was breathtaking. A vast expanse filled with glowing fungi clinging to the walls and ceiling like constellations scattered across the night sky. In the center of the space stood a cluster of crystalline structures resembling spires, their surfaces refracting the light into dazzling patterns. But what truly caught their attention were the figures gathered around a central fire pit. There were at least a dozen of them, humanoid yet distinctly alien. Their skin ranged from deep indigo to pale silver, and their clothing consisted of woven fabrics adorned with intricate beadwork. They looked up as Cale and Niara entered, their expressions wary but not hostile. One of them, a tall individual with long braided hair and markings etched into their skin, stepped forward. "Who are you?" they asked in halting but understandable speech. Cale raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We mean no harm," he replied slowly. "We're looking for shelter." The leader studied them intently, their gaze lingering on Niara. When they noticed the glowing artifact embedded in her chest, their expression shifted from suspicion to recognition. "You bear the mark of the lumen," they said, their tone sharp. Niara flinched visibly, stepping closer to Cale. "Not lumen," she whispered. "Exile." The leader frowned, considering this. After a moment, they gestured for Cale and Niara to sit near the fire. "Tell us your story," they said simply. Over the next hour, Cale recounted their journey, the crash landing, the pursuit by the lumen, and their desperate flight through the forest and underground tunnels. Niara added details about the artifact and the Gyrith vault. Her voice steadied, despite the fear still lurking in her eyes. The strangers listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances among themselves. When they finished, the leader leaned back, their expression thoughtful. "You have come far," they said finally, "and you carry great danger with you." "We know," Cale admitted. "That's why we need help. We can't face the lumen alone." The leader nodded gravely. "We are the Gyrith," they explained, "nomads who refuse to bow to the lumen or any oppressor. This planet is our home, and we protect it fiercely." They paused, studying Cale and Niara once more. "If you wish to survive, you must fight alongside us." Cale exchanged a glance with Niara, who gave a slight nod. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. Over the next few days, the Gyrith welcomed Cale and Niara into their community. They shared food, stories, and knowledge about the planet's unique ecosystem. For the first time since arriving, Cale felt a sense of belonging. The Gyrith were resourceful and resilient, living in harmony with the land while resisting those who sought to exploit it. Niara, too, seemed to find solace among them. She spent hours learning their language and customs, her earlier guardedness giving way to genuine curiosity. One evening, as they sat around the fire, an elder named Sira approached her. Sira carried a staff adorned with glowing crystals, its tip humming softly with energy. "You carry a heavy burden," Sira said gently, pointing to the artifact. "It binds you to forces beyond your control." Niara lowered her head, her hands resting lightly on the glowing object. "I took it to stop them," she murmured. "But now, I don't know what to do." Sira placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "The artifact is part of you, child. You cannot escape it, but you can choose how to wield its power." Cale watched the exchange silently, feeling a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on survival that he hadn't fully considered the emotional toll Niara endured. Determined to support her, He began working closely with the Gyrith to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the Lumen. The Gyrith taught him guerrilla tactics suited to the planet's terrain. Using magnetic fields generated by underground rivers, they devised traps capable of disabling advanced technology. They also showed him how to use explosive crystal formations strategically, turning the environment itself into a weapon. Nayara joined in, contributing insights about the Lumen's weaknesses based on her past experiences. As they trained together, Kale grew closer to Nayara. Late at night, when the campfires burned low and the others slept, they would sit side by side, staring at the stars visible through cracks in the cavern ceiling. Sometimes, they talked about their respective worlds, Earth and the Lumen homeworld, and the injustices they had witnessed. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence, finding comfort in each other's presence. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Nayara turned to Kale with an earnest expression. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Kale smiled, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "We're in this together, remember." Their preparations reached a fever pitch when scouts reported sightings of Lumen enforcers closing in on the Gyrith settlement. The nomads wasted no time fortifying their defenses, using natural barriers and clever engineering to create choke points and ambush zones. Kale and Nayara played key roles in the planning, combining their knowledge of the Lumen with the Gyrith's expertise in guerrilla warfare. On the eve of the expected attack, the entire group gathered around the fire for a final meeting. The leader, whose name was Rael, addressed them solemnly. "Tomorrow, we stand united against tyranny," they declared. "Let us fight not just for ourselves, but for all who seek freedom." Cheers erupted from the crowd, followed by chants in the Gyrith language. Kale felt a surge of determination, bolstered by the camaraderie surrounding him. Beside him, Nayara stood tall, her swirling eyes reflecting the firelight. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together. The dawn broke with an eerie stillness, the air thick with anticipation. The Gyrith settlement buzzed quietly as preparations reached their final stages. Kale tightened the straps of his improvised armor, a patchwork of scavenged materials and woven fibers provided by the Gyrith, and checked his supplies one last time. Beside him, Nayara stood motionless, her shimmering skin reflecting the dim light filtering through cracks in the cavern ceiling. Her hands hovered near the glowing artifact embedded in her chest, its pulsating rhythm matching the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Rael, the leader of the Gyrith, moved among the group, offering words of encouragement and final instructions. "Remember," they said, their voice calm but commanding, "we fight not just for ourselves, but for every being who refuses to live under oppression. Today, we show the Lumen that their power is not absolute." Kale nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. He glanced at Nayara, whose swirling eyes were fixed on the entrance to the cavern. She looked determined, though there was a shadow of fear lingering beneath her composed exterior. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got this," he whispered. "No matter what happens, I've got your back." Nayara turned to him, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "And I have yours," she replied softly. The first signs of the Lumen's arrival came sooner than expected. A distant rumble echoed through the tunnels, growing louder with each passing second. Moments later, the metallic whirring of drums filled the air, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of armored enforcers. The Lumen had arrived. "They're here," shouted one of the Gyrith scouts, rushing back into the cavern. Panic threatened to take hold, but Rael's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "To your positions," they commanded. "Stay sharp." Kale and Nayara took their places near the narrow choke points leading into the settlement. The plan was simple yet risky. Funnel the Lumen into tight spaces where their superior numbers and technology would be less effective. Magnetic traps and explosive crystals lined the tunnels, ready to unleash chaos upon their enemies. As the Lumen advanced, Cal could see them clearly now, sleek, humanoid figures clad in reinforced armor, their weapons glowing ominously. They moved with precision, scanning the area methodically. Behind them floated several drones, their red sensors sweeping the terrain for threats. "Wait for it," Kale muttered under his breath, gripping a makeshift spear crafted from sharpened crystal and wood. Beside him, Neera held a staff similar to Sira's, its tip humming with latent energy. The first wave of lumens stepped into the trap zone. On Ral's signal, Kale triggered the magnetic field generator hidden within the walls. Arcs of electricity surged outward, disrupting the drone's navigation systems. Two of them plummeted to the ground, sparking wildly. At the same time, Neera activated a detonator, causing a cascade of explosive crystals to collapse part of the tunnel behind the lumen forces, cutting off reinforcements. Chaos erupted as the lumens scrambled to regroup. The Gyrith seized the opportunity, launching a coordinated counterattack. Spears flew through the air, striking true against exposed joints in the lumen's armor. Guerrilla fighters darted in and out of cover, using the terrain to their advantage. Kale found himself face to face with a lumen enforcer, its weapon raised menacingly. Adrenaline surged through him as he sidestepped a blast of energy, driving his spear upward into the weak point beneath the enforcer's helmet. The figure stumbled backward, collapsing onto the rocky floor. Without pausing, Kale turned to help another Gyrith fighter fend off a second wave of attackers. Meanwhile, Neera fought with a grace that defied her earlier fragility. Her staff glowed brighter with each swing, emitting pulses of energy that disoriented the lumen. One particularly aggressive enforcer lunged at her, only for her to deflect the attack with a swift parry. With a decisive strike, she sent a burst of energy coursing through the enforcer's armor, rendering it immobile. Despite their early successes, the battle was far from over. Reinforcements poured into the cavern, overwhelming the defenders. The Gyrith fought valiantly, but their numbers dwindled rapidly. Kale saw Ril go down during a fierce melee, clutching a wound inflicted by a lumen blade. Anger flared within him, fueling his determination to protect those who had taken him in. "We can't hold them much longer," shouted Sira, rallying the remaining fighters. "Fall back to the inner sanctum." Kale grabbed Neera's arm, pulling her toward the designated safe zone. As they retreated, he noticed something alarming. The artifact in her chest was glowing brighter than ever before, its runes shifting erratically. "What's happening?" he demanded, concern etched across his face. Neera shook her head, her expression grim. "It's reacting to the lumen, to their technology. If they get too close, it might." Before she could finish, a massive explosion rocked the cavern. A section of the ceiling collapsed, separating Kale and Neera from the rest of the group. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring their vision. When the dust settled, they found themselves trapped in a smaller chamber, surrounded by lumen enforcers. "There's nowhere left to run," sneered one of the enforcers, stepping forward. His voice carried a cold authority. "Hand over the artifact, Exile, and perhaps we'll make your death quick." Neera straightened, her posture defiant. "Never," she spat, her voice laced with venom. Turning to Kale, she whispered urgently, "You need to leave. Find the vault without me." "No way," Kale shot back, gripping his spear tightly. "I'm not leaving you." A sudden realization struck Neera. Her gaze locked onto the artifact, its glow reaching an almost blinding intensity. "There's one thing I can do," she said softly, "but it will cost me." Cal's heart sank. "Don't even think about it," he growled. "We'll find another way." "There isn't time," Neera replied, tears glistening in her swirling eyes. "Trust me." Before Cal could stop her, Neera placed both hands over the artifact and closed her eyes. A surge of energy radiated outward, forming a translucent barrier around the chamber. The lumen enforcers recoiled, their weapons unable to penetrate the shield. However, the effort visibly drained Neera. Her shimmering skin dimmed significantly, and she swayed on her feet. "What did you do?" Kale asked, panic rising in his chest. "I activated the artifact's failsafe," Neera explained weakly. It creates a temporary barrier, but it's draining my life force." She managed a small smile, despite her obvious pain. "Go, Kale. Finish what we started." Kale hesitated, torn between staying with Niera and fulfilling their mission. Finally, he nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "I won't let this be for nothing," he vowed. "I promise." With one last look at Niera, he sprinted toward the exit, dodging fallen debris and pursuing lumen forces. Behind him, the barrier flickered, holding strong just long enough for him to escape. Hours later, Kale emerged into the open air, battered but alive. The map shard guided him toward the location of the Gyrith Vault, its holographic projection casting ghostly blue light across the alien landscape. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by guilt and grief. But he pressed on, driven by the memory of Niera's sacrifice. He wasn't alone for long. Surviving members of the Gyrith joined him along the way, including Sira, who carried Ral's staff as a symbol of leadership. Together, they vowed to honor Niera's bravery by ensuring the artifact never fell into the wrong hands again. The entrance to the Gyrith Vault loomed before them, an ancient structure carved into the side of a towering cliff. Its surface shimmered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change under the dim light of the alien sun. The air around it hummed faintly, charged with energy that made Kale's skin tingle. It was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, a testament to a civilization far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. Kale stood at the forefront of the group, clutching the map shard tightly in his hand. Behind him, the surviving Gyrith warriors gathered, their faces etched with determination and exhaustion. Sira stepped forward, Ral's staff held firmly in her grasp. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of everything they had endured. "Let us proceed with caution." As they approached the vault, the holographic projection from the map shard aligned perfectly with the massive circular door etched with claw-like designs. Niera's warnings echoed in Cal's mind. This place held unimaginable power, capable of reshaping entire star systems. He couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and resolve as he examined the runes glowing faintly on the artifact embedded in his pack. Though Niera was gone, her sacrifice had ensured they reached this point. Now, it was up to them to finish what she started. Sira placed her hand on the central rune of the door, triggering a low rumble as the mechanism came to life. The ground beneath them vibrated as sections of the door slid apart, revealing a narrow passageway leading deep into the heart of the vault. The air inside was cool and still, carrying an otherworldly silence that sent shivers down Cal's spine. They moved cautiously through the corridor, their footsteps echoing softly against the smooth metallic walls. The interior of the vault was unlike anything Cal had seen before. Glowing panels lined the ceiling, casting soft blue light across the space. Strange symbols floated midair, shifting and rearranging themselves like living entities. At the end of the corridor stood a pedestal, atop which rested a crystalline orb pulsating with radiant energy. "This must be it," Cal murmured, stepping closer to the orb. He hesitated, remembering Niera's words about the dangers of unchecked power. "We can't let anyone misuse this, not even ourselves." Sira nodded solemnly. "Then we must destroy it." Destroying the orb wasn't as simple as smashing it. As they studied the pedestal, they discovered that removing the orb would trigger a fail-safe mechanism designed to unleash its full potential if tampered with improperly. The Lumen had likely accounted for such attempts, ensuring that only those who understood its true purpose could control or dismantle it. Kale pulled out the map shard once more, examining the holographic projection closely. Among the glowing lines and symbols, he noticed something new, a sequence of instructions detailing how to deactivate the orb safely. It required precise timing and coordination, using the artifact Niera had sacrificed so much to protect. With trembling hands, Kale retrieved the artifact from his pack. Its glow had dimmed significantly since Niera's final act, but it still pulsed faintly, as though holding onto the last remnants of her presence. Placing it near the orb, he followed the instructions step by step, guided by Sira and the other Gyrith. Each movement felt deliberate. Each decision weighed heavily with the knowledge of what failure might mean. Finally, after what felt like hours, the orb began to dim. The glowing symbols floating around them dissipated, leaving the vault silent and dark. A sense of relief washed over the group, but it was bittersweet. They had succeeded in neutralizing the threat, but at great cost. Back outside, the survivors gathered around a makeshift memorial constructed in honor of those who had fallen during the battle. Ni'era's name was etched prominently among them, written in both Earth's alphabet and the flowing script of the Gyrith language. Kale stood quietly, his gaze fixed on the inscription. He thought of her courage, her defiance against tyranny, and the ultimate price she had paid to protect others. She believed in freedom, Sira said softly, standing beside him. Not just for her people, but for all beings. Her spirit will live on in our fight. Kale nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. She saved us all, he replied, and I won't let her sacrifice be forgotten. In the days that followed, the Gyrith worked tirelessly to rebuild their settlement. With the Lumen defeated and the vault secured, they focused on healing and preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. Kale stayed with them, learning more about their culture and sharing stories of Earth. In turn, they taught him survival skills suited to the planet's unique environment, strengthening the bond between humans and aliens. But Kale knew his journey wasn't over yet. His ship, Eos, remained damaged, stranded miles away from the wreckage site. Repairing it would take time, but he was determined to return home, to share what he had learned and warn humanity about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Yet the thought of leaving filled him with conflicting emotions. This planet and its people had become a second home to him. One evening, as he sat near the glowing river with Sira, she handed him a small device crafted by the Gyrith artisans. "Take this," she said. "It will help sustain you on your journey back to the stars." Kale accepted it gratefully, turning it over in his hands. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for everything." Sira smiled warmly. "You've earned your place among us, Calvos, but your path lies elsewhere now. Go, and may the stars guide you." Weeks later, Kale stood before the repaired hull of Eos, ready to embark on the long journey back to Earth. The Gyrith had gathered to bid him farewell, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and sadness. As he climbed aboard, Sira approached him one last time. "Remember us," she said simply. "I always will," Kale replied, his voice thick with emotion. With a final nod, he sealed the hatch and powered up the engines. As the ship ascended into the twilight sky, he glanced out the window, watching the glowing forests and crystalline spires grow smaller below. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of silver light amidst the trees, a shimmering figure standing tall and proud. He blinked, unsure if it was real or just his imagination. But deep down, he knew. Ni'era's spirit lived on, not just in the memories of those she had touched, but in the hope she had inspired. Together, they had fought for freedom, proving that unity transcended species and worlds. And though their paths diverged, their bond remained unbreakable. As Eos broke free of the planet's atmosphere and soared toward the stars, Kale felt a renewed sense of purpose. His mission was clear: to spread the message of resistance, compassion, and unity. For in a universe fraught with danger and division, there was always room for hope.